beads are called Mobius beads. And you can see that they don't have a pattern in common, they all have a common shape. And it's the shape that is the Mobius shape. They were first introduced by Mike Bessler, who was a math teacher in Alaska. He was inspired by the Mobius strip, which is a mathematical phenomenon where you twist a piece of paper like this and it's actually a one-sided object. It's a mathematical principle. So he was inspired by that to create these beads, which they're kind of hard to figure out where they start and where they end. You can use any pattern, any plain color clay, anything you want for this. You're going to start with a square, a fairly thin square. Obviously you can do them, you make your starting square any size, because you can have any size bead you want. I'm going to do a fairly large one on a plain piece of clay so you aren't distracted by the pattern. And I'm going to make it fairly large so it'll be easier for you to see exactly what I'm doing. In principle, you just pinch two opposite ends together, but it takes a little bit of coaxing, and it's not quite as easy as it might be. Now, if you want, you can use, if you have square cutters, you can just cut a square piece of clay and get started. Again, these cutters, you hold them with the gold part, and then if the clay gets stuck, then you get to push that little plunger and pop that piece right out. I'm going to actually cut a slightly larger square for you so you can really see what's going on. You'll see how good I am at cutting squares without a ruler. Don't judge me if it's not quite square. Okay, pretty good. So basically with this, in theory, all you're going to do is pinch these two corners together and these two corners together. But if you in opposite directions. But if you just go at it like that, it's going to be kind of an odd shape. So you really have to coax it a little bit. That is all you're doing. You see, I'm taking opposite corners, bringing them together, and then the other opposite corners come down this other way. But you have to make sure your clay is actually cooperating. So it's going to take a little bit of back and forth. It seems like you get one end and then the next end pops back out the other direction. So you have to be a little patient. Hey, that's not too bad. So you can see it's a little bit lopsided. At that point you can take a tool or your fingers, depending on how tiny the bead is. A little one like that, you're going to want to get a knitting tool in there. Just to kind of get it more symmetrical. You can kind of push that inner part back up. See, I'm kind of rolling it a little bit like that. And get one side with a nice interior shape. And then you can go here. Of course, there's no right or wrong. You can actually have your top a little bit flatter if you want, or however you want it. But that's the general principle. You're just taking two opposite corners and pinching them together. I'll show you one more time on this little one. Two corners are going to pinch one way. The other two corners are going to pinch in the opposite way. And don't rush it. I'm just going to kind of ease those together. Ooh, that's a nice one too. Now the tricky part is getting a hole in it. What I'd suggest is you actually give it a pretty good pinch up there so that you really do have a good base to put the hole through. Kind of join those ends together. And sometimes if you start with a fine tool and go right, you want to go right straight through, you're going to go through that open space. Actually, sometimes when you're stringing those, it's fun to add a little bead in there. Have something hiding in those little open spaces. We're going to go right through the middle and right out the other end. And there's your stringing hole. And let me show you one more little trick. See if I can lift clay here. Alright, sometimes that is pretty tricky to get that last hole in. So sometimes it helps if you actually pierce your square right in the middle. You can do that on a knitting needle. You can actually just do it on toothpicks and have them all individually speared like that. And you can do the forming right on the spindle. So here I'm going to pull up my two opposite sides, and then I'm going to coax down my two bottom sides. And again, you don't want to rush it, you just want to ease them down and play with it a little bit. But you can actually form it right on there. Make sure you join it so it's actually joined together into a little, you know, a hole, not just a gap. You want to form a hole. And obviously I'm destroying this one as I'm demonstrating, but then you can just bake it just like this. It's hard to do it with this clay is pretty soft, so it's kind of squishing. But you see the principle where you're actually forming it right on the spindle so that you can just bake it like that, and then when it's done you can pop it right off. Or you can form it by hand and then put your hole through. So that is the Mobius bead. Very simple, but obviously a very, very effective technique, and it's actually a great way to use up scraps. If you have old cane ends or anything like that, you can just make a bunch of Mobius beads.